The morning Eleanor Whitmore married a man with no boots and no name, her mother stood at the church door and told her she was dead to her. Eleanor didn't cry. She took the beggar's rough hand, looked straight ahead, and walked into a life nobody believed she deserved. She had no idea what she'd just done. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, follow along to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Eleanor Whitmore had exactly 3 things left to her name. The summer of 1814, a wool dress that had seen better decades. A small leather satchel her grandmother had pressed into her hands the week before dying, and a mother whose love had always come with conditions she could never quite meet. She stood in the kitchen of the Whitmore house, a fine house by Savannah standards, with good oak floors and curtains her mother ordered from Charleston, and she listened to the sound of her future being arranged around her like furniture she hadn't chosen. "Thomas Aldridge has made his intentions known," her mother Catherine Whitmore said from across the table. She didn't look up from the letter in her hands. "He will call on Friday. You will be presentable. You will be agreeable." "Thomas Aldridge is 53 years old," Eleanor said. "Thomas Aldridge owns the mill, the grain warehouse, and has the ear of the county magistrate." Catherine set the letter down with the particular precision of a woman who considered every movement a statement. "You are 22, Eleanor. You have no dowry that amounts to anything meaningful, and your father's debts didn't disappear when he did. Thomas Aldridge is not a choice. He is a solution." Eleanor looked at her mother's hands. Smooth, rings on 3 fingers. Catherine Whitmore had never in her life done work that left marks. "I won't marry him," Eleanor said quietly. The room went very still. "I beg your pardon. I said I won't marry him." Eleanor picked up her satchel from the chair beside her. "Not Thomas Aldridge. Not anyone you choose for me." Catherine stood up from the table slowly, the way she always did when she wanted to remind a room that she was the tallest person in it. "You will do what is necessary for this family. Your father left us in a shameful position, and it falls to me, it has always fallen to me to correct it. A good marriage is the only currency a woman in your situation has. I will not allow you to throw it away because you have some romantic notion about—" "I don't have romantic notions," Eleanor said. "I have standards. There's a difference." Catherine's expression didn't change. That was always the most frightening thing about her, the way her face stayed perfectly composed, even when her voice dropped to something colder than winter river water. "You will receive Thomas Aldridge on Friday," she said, "or you will leave this house." Eleanor looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she picked up her satchel and walked out. Ciao. She didn't go far that first night. She had 3 coins in her satchel and the address of a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who took in boarders on Elm Street, and she spent the first of those coins on a room the size of a generous closet and lay on a rope mattress listening to Savannah breathe through the open window. She told herself it would be fine. She told herself it twice, which was usually a sign it wouldn't be. By the 3rd day, she had spent 2 of her 3 coins on bread and realized she needed work, and the kind of work available to a woman of no particular skill, and suddenly reduced circumstances in Savannah in the summer of 1814 was mostly invisible labor laundry, mending serving. She took a mending job at a tailor's on Market Street. She wasn't fast, but she was careful, and the tailor, Mr. Oakes, paid her enough to keep her room and eat if she was careful about it. She didn't tell her mother where she was. She didn't go back. The weeks passed. She learned which days the market had the cheapest produce and which streets cooled fastest at dusk. She learned that Mrs. Hartley's other boarders, a seamstress named Dora and a widowed teacher named Mrs. Pruitt, were better company than anyone she'd shared a parlor with in her mother's house. She thought some days that she might actually be managing. Then her mother found her. Catherine Whitmore appeared at the tailor's shop on a Thursday morning in July, wearing her best visiting dress and an expression Eleanor recognized as the one she wore when she intended to win something. "You look thin," her mother said, surveying her the way she might survey furniture she was considering returning. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, not stopping her work. "You're mending trousers in a back room, Eleanor. This is not fine." Catherine sat down without being invited. I didn't come to argue. I came because I have found you a better option. Eleanor looked up. Not Thomas Aldridge, Catherine said quickly. I understand you have objections. I am presenting you with a different arrangement. She paused. A man has approached Reverend Clover seeking a wife. He is not from Savannah. He has means, he says, though he presents himself modestly. He is looking for a woman of some education and character who is willing to marry without extensive prior acquaintance. That is a very careful description, Eleanor said. What's wrong with him? I didn't say anything was wrong. You said he presents himself modestly. That means he doesn't look the part of what he's claiming. Eleanor set her sewing down. How old is he? What does he actually look like? Where does he come from? Catherine's composure flickered, just slightly. He is perhaps 35. He dresses plainly. His hands suggest he has done physical work. He did not offer extensive personal history, and Reverend Clover thought it best not to press. Mother! Eleanor stared at her. You are describing a stranger with no stated background who appeared asking for a wife. That is not an arrangement. That is a warning. He offered a marriage settlement, Catherine said, and here her voice shifted in a way that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. A significant one. Enough to cover your father's remaining debts entirely. Enough that you would never need to sit in a back room mending strangers' trousers again. The shop was very quiet. Why would a man with the means offer a significant settlement to marry a woman he's never met? Eleanor asked. Men have their reasons, Catherine said. This is not a negotiation, Eleanor. I am telling you that the opportunity exists. You have, she looked at the sewing in Eleanor's hands, demonstrated you are capable of surviving without assistance. Now, I am asking you to consider that surviving and living are not the same thing. Eleanor put the sewing down. I want to meet him, she said. Before I agree to anything, I want to look at him myself. Catherine nodded, like she'd expected this, like she'd already won. That should have been the warning. His name, Reverend Clover told her, was William Cross. He was waiting in this reverend's garden when Eleanor arrived on a Friday afternoon, standing with his back to her, looking at something in the hedgerow. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than she'd expected. His coat was clean, but simple, the kind of garment made for function, and his boots were worn in the particular way that came from long use rather than poverty. There was a difference, her grandmother had always said, between a man who couldn't afford good boots and a man who'd walked hard enough to wear them down. He turned when he heard her. She had expected she didn't know what she'd expected. Something easier to dismiss, maybe. He had dark eyes that took her in without apology, and the kind of face that didn't announce itself, but that you kept returning to like a sentence you hadn't quite parsed. There was a scar along his jaw, old and silver. His hands when Reverend Clover introduced them, and he reached to shake hers with a slight corrective pause, as though he'd started to do something else, and redirected, were indeed the hands of a man who had done real work. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice was quiet. Even. Mr. Cross, she said. They sat in the garden while Reverend Clover hovered at a diplomatic distance and made occasional remarks about the heat, and Eleanor asked William Cross the questions she had prepared. Where was he from, Virginia, originally? He'd been away some years. What work had he done? Various things. Management of property some years ago. He'd been traveling recently. Did he have family? Some. He was not close with them currently. Why did he want to marry a woman he'd never met in a city he didn't live in? A pause, the longest pause of the conversation. I find myself at a point, he said carefully, where I need to build something new. I'm better at that with a partner. He looked at her directly. I realize that's not a conventional answer. It's an honest one, Eleanor said. I don't know if it's a good one. No, he agreed. It might not be. She looked at him for a moment. Why me? Reverend Clover spoke highly of you, your character, your education. Another pause. The fact that you left a comfortable situation rather than accept a marriage you found intolerable suggested to me that you have some courage. Eleanor felt something shift slightly in her chest. "I haven't agreed to anything," she said. "No," he said. "I know." She told herself she needed 3 days to decide. She decided in one. Not because William Cross was warm, or because she trusted him completely, or because her mother's pressure had simply worn her down, though all of those things were partially true. She decided because she sat in her closet room at Mrs. Hartley's that Friday night and made a list the way her grandmother had taught her to of what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew: William Cross was calm, direct, and did not look at her the way Thomas Aldridge had, like inventory. He had a scar and worn boots and didn't explain himself more than necessary. The settlement he'd offered was real. Reverend Clover had confirmed the funds existed. He had not touched her hand longer than courtesy required, and had not told her she would be cared for, which was what men said when they meant controlled. What she didn't know: nearly everything else. But she was sleeping on a rope mattress and mending trousers for coins, and she had learned in these past weeks that freedom had a cost she could pay, but that she'd prefer, if possible, to pay it somewhere with better footing. She sent word to Reverend Clover in the morning. "Ma'am, the wedding was small by necessity, and by both their apparent preferences. A Tuesday, late morning. The church was cool and smelled of beeswax and cut grass, and there were 6 people in the pews, Mrs. Hartley and Dora, who'd asked to come. Reverend Clover's wife, 2 men Eleanor didn't know who seemed to be acquainted with William, and in the back row, her mother. Catherine Whitmore sat perfectly straight and watched her daughter walk to the front of the church and did not smile. When Eleanor reached the altar and glanced back once she didn't know why she did, her mother met her eyes and said nothing, just looked. Eleanor turned back to face Reverend Clover. William Cross stood beside her. He didn't reach for her hand before the vows which she appreciated. He waited until it was required. "Do you, Eleanor Ann Whitmore, take this man?" From the back row, clearly audible in the small church, came Catherine Whitmore's voice. "She is throwing herself away," her mother said. "Not to anyone in particular, to the room. On a man with no name worth knowing and no standing. She is throwing her life away, and she will understand that when it's too late." The church went absolutely silent. Reverend Clover stopped. Eleanor felt William go still beside her. She turned slowly to look at her mother. Catherine sat with her back straight, and her chin lifted, and an expression on her face that was not cruelty. Eleanor had spent 22 years learning the difference. But grief converted the way her mother always converted everything that hurt her into armor. "Mother," Eleanor said quietly, "you are at my wedding. I am watching my daughter make the worst mistake of her life in a church that should have more sense than to allow it." "Then you are welcome to leave." Catherine stood up. For one moment Eleanor thought she would walk out. That would have been manageable. That she could have survived. Instead, her mother said in the same carrying, composed voice, "When this falls apart, and it will fall apart, Eleanor, because you have chosen a ghost of a man who won't even tell you where he comes from. Don't come to me. Whatever door you've just closed, you've closed it yourself." She walked out. The door shut. Eleanor stood at the altar in the ringing silence, 6 pairs of eyes on her back, and did not move. Then William Cross quietly said, "Miss Whitmore." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not pity, not discomfort. Something more careful than either. "We don't have to continue," he said. "If you'd rather not, I would understand." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Reverend Clover," she said, "please continue." She didn't cry, not in the church and not in the hired carriage afterward while Savannah moved past the window in heat haze and silence. William Cross sat across from her and did not attempt to fill the quiet, which was the first thing he did that she actively approved of. They were 2 hours from the city before she said anything. "You should know," she said, "that I don't regret it." He looked at her. "What she said," Eleanor clarified, I'm not sitting here wishing I'd gone back. I want you to know that because I suspect I'm going to be quiet for a while and I don't want you to read the quiet incorrectly. A pause. Then, I appreciate you saying that. I also want you to know, she said, that I will need you to be honest with me. Whatever you haven't told me, and I know there are things I am not asking you tonight, but I will ask eventually, and I need you to tell me the truth when I do. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, even eyes. That's fair, he said. Good, Eleanor said, and turned back to the window. The carriage moved north. The city fell away behind them. The summer land opened out around them, green and wide and indifferent. And Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Cross. Now a name she was still turning over in her mouth like a strange coin, watched it pass and thought, whatever comes next, I chose this. That has to count for something. She didn't know yet what she'd married into. She didn't know about the title or the estate, or the name William Cross wasn't using. She didn't know that the two quiet men in the church had ridden ahead to prepare a house the size of which would stop her breathing when she first saw it. She didn't know any of it. But she'd chosen with her own hands and her own voice in a church while her mother walked out. And whatever William Cross turned out to be, whatever he was keeping, whatever he was hiding, whatever truth was sitting in the space between his careful answers and his worn-down boots, she had not been chosen like furniture. She had chosen. The road stretched out ahead. The summer air came through the carriage window, thick and warm, and smelling of Georgia pine. Eleanor Cross sat up straight, folded her hands in her lap, and rode toward whatever she'd done. The carriage stopped just before sundown. Eleanor heard the horses slow, felt the wheels find gravel instead of packed road, and looked out the window. She stopped breathing. It wasn't a house. It was an estate. 3 stories of pale brick rising behind iron gates, flanked by oak trees so old they'd grown into each other overhead, forming a tunnel of shadow and green, that the evening light came through in long broken pieces. There were wings on either side of the main structure. There was a stable block that was larger than any building on her mother's street in Savannah. There were figures moving on the ground staff, she realized, actual staff positioned and waiting. She turned to look at William Cross. He was watching her face. "You said property management," she said. "I did," he agreed. "This is not property management. This is—" She stopped, looked back out the window. "How large is this?" "The main house has 42 rooms," he said in the same even tone he'd used to discuss the weather 2 hours ago. "The grounds run to about 800 acres. There's a tenant farm on the eastern boundary and a mill on the creek to the north." Eleanor stared at him. "William," she said slowly, "who are you?" He held her gaze for a moment, not evasively, not with the look of a man about to run, more like a man who has been waiting for the exact right moment to put something heavy down. "Inside," he said quietly. "I'll tell you inside." The staff lined up in the entrance hall numbered 11. Eleanor counted them because it gave her something to do with her eyes, while her heartbeat did something unsteady in her chest. They were formally dressed, all of them, and they looked at her with expressions ranging from professionally neutral to barely concealed curiosity. A woman at the front of the line, 50s iron-gray hair, the posture of someone who'd been running household since before Eleanor was born, stepped forward and dipped a slight precise curtsy. "Mrs. Cross," she said, "welcome to Harrow Hall. I'm Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper. We're very glad to have you." Eleanor said, "Thank you, Mrs. Dalton," because it was the only thing available to say, and felt acutely with every fiber of her being the particular absurdity of the moment she had been mending trousers in a back room 4 days ago. William moved through his own entrance hall with the ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. He spoke briefly to 2 of the male staff, asked Mrs. Dalton something in a low voice, and then turned back to Eleanor. "There's a sitting room," he said. "If you'll come with me." She followed him. The sitting room was not a sitting room in any sense she'd grown up understanding the word. It was larger than the entire ground floor of her mother's house, and lined floor to ceiling with books that had clearly been read, not displayed. A fire was going despite the summer evening. 2 chairs had been placed near it close enough for conversation. Someone had arranged this. Someone had known they were coming. Eleanor sat down and looked at her husband. "Tell me," she said. William Cross sat across from her, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, "My name is William Edmund Cross Ashford. The Cross is my mother's family name. Ashford is my father's. I hold the title of Duke of Ashford by inheritance from my father who died 14 months ago." The fire crackled. Eleanor sat very still. "You're a duke," she said. "Yes. You came to Savannah dressed in plain clothes and introduced yourself with half your name and married me in a small church with 6 people in the pews." "Yes." "Why?" Her voice was even. She was distantly proud of that. Why any of this? Why not simply, "Because every woman presented to me in the last 2 years," he said, was presented to the title. "Every conversation I had was a conversation with the dukedom. Every smile, every gracious word, every expression of interest, I could not tell, with any of them, whether they were speaking to me or to Harrow Hall." He paused. "I wanted to know what it was like to be chosen for something other than what I inherited." The room was quiet. "So you tested women?" Eleanor said. "I wouldn't use that word." "What word would you use?" Another pause. "I was looking for someone who would make a decision without knowing the stakes." "That's the same thing," Eleanor said flatly. "You withheld information that was material to my decision, and you call it something other than a test, but the outcome is identical." She stood up from the chair, which she hadn't planned to do, but her body seemed to have opinions about this that her composure hadn't caught up with yet. "I left my mother's house. I gave up what little standing I had left. I stood at an altar while my mother told a church full of people I was throwing my life away, and I stayed. I stayed because I thought—" She stopped. "What did you think?" he asked quietly. She looked at him. "I thought you were honest," she said. "I thought that was the one thing you were." He didn't look away. "Everything I told you was true. You told me half." "Yes," he said. "I did." And then, in a voice that had dropped some of its evenness, "I'm sorry, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss in front of it. She noticed that despite everything. Mrs. Dalton showed her to a bedroom that was larger than her entire boarding house floor, and Eleanor sat on the edge of a bed that probably cost more than her father's total estate, and she thought very carefully about what she knew and what she was going to do with it. She was married to a duke. She was living in a 42-room house on 800 acres. Her mother, who had called her a fool at her own wedding, did not know any of this. That last part sat in her chest with a complicated weight she wasn't sure yet whether to call satisfaction or grief. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was light outside the curtains, and the birds in the oak trees had already started. She came down to breakfast the next morning at 7 o'clock because lying in an enormous bed, feeling uncertain, was not her preferred method of handling an uncertain situation. William was already at the table. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and the gesture caught her off guard enough that she nearly said something about it. She sat down instead. Accepted coffee from a footman who appeared from a doorway she hadn't noticed. Looked across the table at her husband. "I'd like to understand the estate," she said. "How it runs, what the responsibilities are." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to know about the estate? I'm living in it. I presume I have some role in its management, given that I'm whatever I am here." She paused. "What am I here exactly?" "You're my wife. I know the word. What does it mean here? Do I manage the household? Do I attend events with you? Are there social obligations I should know about? I need to understand what I've actually entered into." Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't tell what it was. Recognition, maybe, or recalibration. "You're very practical," he said. "I'm trying to be," Eleanor said. "I find it easier than the alternative." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are social obligations, yes. The county knows I've been away. There will be expectation that we receive visitors. There are tenants on the eastern property who will need to meet you eventually. The household runs itself under Mrs. Dalton, but a mistress of the house is expected to have some authority over domestic decisions. He paused. And there is my mother. Eleanor looked up from her coffee. She lives at the Ashford townhouse in Charleston, he said carefully. She does not live here. However, she doesn't know about the marriage, Eleanor said. The silence confirmed it before he did. She doesn't know about the marriage, he said. No. Eleanor set her coffee down. When does she find out? I sent a letter when we left Savannah, so she finds out by letter that a woman she's never met is now the Duchess of Ashford. Eleanor looked at him steadily. When do I meet her? She'll come, he said with the resigned certainty of a man who has known someone his entire life. Probably within the week. Good, Eleanor said. Then I have a week to learn enough about this house to hold my own ground when she arrives. She picked up her coffee again. William Cross Ashford. She was still adjusting to that, watched her across the table. With that expression, she was beginning to identify the one that meant he was reassessing something he thought he'd already calculated. She didn't find it as satisfying as she perhaps should have. She was still angry about the test. The week was instructive. Mrs. Dalton, who had been running Harrow Hall for 16 years and had opinions about everything, turned out to be Eleanor's most useful education. She walked Eleanor through the house with the thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting for someone to be genuinely interested. The kitchens, the linen rooms, the accounts ledgers that had been, she noted with a pointed neutrality, somewhat neglected during His Grace's period of travel. How long was he gone? Eleanor asked on the third day, running her finger down a column of household expenses. 2 years, 3 months, Mrs. Dalton said. Before that he was here, but... She stopped. But, Eleanor prompted. Mrs. Dalton considered her with the look of a woman calibrating how much to trust a person she'd known for 72 hours. Whatever she concluded, it tipped toward candor. After the late Duke died, His Grace was here in body. Less so in other ways. He and his father were not. It was a complicated relationship, ma'am. The inheritance was not simple. What was complicated about it? That would be His Grace's to tell, Mrs. Dalton said firmly, but not unkindly. What I can say is that the house is glad he's back, and it's glad he brought someone home. Eleanor looked at her. You've been here 16 years, she said. Do you think he made a reasonable choice, doing it the way he did? Mrs. Dalton was quiet for a moment. Then, I think His Grace has spent most of his life being looked at instead of seen. I think he did something about it in the only way he knew how. She paused. Whether it was the right way is another question. That's a very diplomatic answer, Eleanor said. I've been a housekeeper for a duke for 16 years, Mrs. Dalton said. Diplomacy is a survival skill. She found the library on the 4th day by accident through a door she'd assumed was a closet. It was a real library, not decorative, not the kind of room designed to impress visitors with the appearance of learning. The books were in no particular order. Some were shelved sideways. There were notes tucked into several of them, written in a cramped left-leaning hand. She pulled one out and looked at it. The note said wrong about the irrigation argument. See Coleridge, counter page 247. Though C is also wrong in his own way, and the actual answer is probably somewhere neither of them thought to look. Eleanor stood in the library for a long time looking at that note. When she came out, William was in the hallway. He stopped when he saw her face. What? He said. You write in your books, she said. A pause. Yes. You argue with them. Sometimes they're wrong. She looked at him. My father used to do that. He drove my mother absolutely mad. She thought it was disrespectful to the author. Something moved across his face, quiet, careful. What did you think? I thought he was having a conversation, Eleanor said. I thought that was the point. They stood in the hallway and didn't say anything else for a moment. and Eleanor was aware with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable that this was the first time since the sitting room conversation that she'd felt something other than anger when she looked at him. That felt important to note, even if she wasn't sure what to do with it yet. The letter from his mother arrived on the 5th day. Eleanor knew it was from his mother because William read it at the breakfast table, and his expression, which was normally the expression of a man with very good emotional control, did something involuntary that she clocked in the quarter second before he reassembled it. "She's coming Friday," he said. "You said within the week," Eleanor replied. "You were right. I usually am about her," he said. It wasn't pride. It was the particular resignation of someone who knows exactly how a mechanism works, because they've watched it their entire life. "What should I know?" Eleanor said. "About how she operates." He looked at her. "She'll be gracious. Absolutely gracious. Perfect manners, perfect warmth, perfect welcome. And every single pleasant thing she says will be designed to find out exactly who you are and whether you're a problem. And if she decides I'm a problem, she'll still be gracious," he said. "She'll just also be working very quietly to unmake the situation." Eleanor picked up her coffee. "How do I handle that?" "Most people try to match her," William said. "Graciousness for graciousness. It doesn't work. She's had 53 years of practice, and she genuinely enjoys it." "So what works?" A pause. "Honesty, usually. She doesn't know what to do with it. She's never trusted it, which means it disarms her in ways that performance never does." Eleanor looked at him across the table. "You've studied her." "She's my mother," he said simply. "I've spent my whole life trying to understand her. I still get it wrong." He picked up his own coffee. "What I know is she will try to make you feel like a stranger in this house, like you wandered in from somewhere smaller and are only temporarily tolerated. Don't let her." "This is my house," Eleanor said. "Yes," William said, with a certainty that surprised her. "It is." Ooh. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford arrived on Friday morning in a carriage that made the one Eleanor had traveled in look modest. She was a small woman, which Eleanor hadn't expected. Something about the accumulated descriptions had made her imagine someone physically imposing. But Margaret Ashford was perhaps 5 feet and 2 inches silver-haired, dressed in deep blue with pearl earrings, and she carried herself with the absolute assurance of a woman who had never once in her life wondered whether she belonged in a room. She looked at Eleanor with the pleasantest expression Eleanor had ever seen conceal a comprehensive assessment. "My dear," she said, taking Eleanor's hands. "What a surprise, a lovely surprise. William has always done things in his own way, but I confess this exceeded even my expectations." A soft musical laugh. "I do wish I'd been given the opportunity to welcome you properly from the beginning." "Your Grace," Eleanor said. "I'm very glad to finally meet you. Margaret, please. We're family now." Another warm smile. "Tell me everything about yourself. I want to know who my son has chosen." It was perfectly done. The warmth, the intimacy, the implication that Eleanor was the chosen rather than the chooser. Eleanor felt it land and recognized it for what it was. She smiled back. "What would you like to know?" she asked. "Everything," Margaret said pleasantly. "Starting perhaps with your family." "My father was a merchant," Eleanor said. "He died when I was 18. My mother remains in Savannah. We're not currently close." "Oh." The sympathy was immediate and genuine seeming. "I'm sorry to hear that. Family estrangements are so painful." "They can be," Eleanor agreed, "though sometimes distance is the kindest form a relationship can take." A tiny pause, almost imperceptible. Margaret looked at her with slightly more attention than before. "How very philosophical," she said. "My father used to say that," Eleanor said. "He was a great reader. He argued with his books." She let that settle for just a moment. "William does the same thing. I find I understand him a little better for knowing that about my father." The pause this time was slightly longer. Margaret looked at her son. William, to his credit, was looking at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't read in full, but part of it she was almost certain was something she'd classify as startled respect. "Well?" Margaret said, and for the first time since she'd stepped out of that carriage, her voice carried something other than performance, something close to genuine consideration. "I can see this will be an interesting acquaintance." "I hope so," Eleanor said. "I've been told you're not easily surprised." Margaret looked at her for a long assessing moment. Then she laughed briefly but actually. "No," she said, "I'm not, which means you've managed something rather rare." She glanced at her son again. "I see what you did, William. I'm not sure I approve of how, but—" She turned back to Eleanor. "I begin to see why." It was not a victory. Eleanor knew better than to call it that. It was the end of the opening move in what would clearly be a long and complicated game. Margaret Ashford had not been won over. She had been interested, which was a different thing entirely, and a more dangerous one. But Eleanor Cross. Eleanor Ashford, she supposed, though the name still sat strangely, had held her ground on day one. She had stood in her own house and not felt like a stranger in it. That was enough for now. The rest would come. William caught her eye across the room as a footman led his mother toward the drawing room, and something passed between them. Quick, wordless, and more honest than anything they'd managed to say out loud since the carriage ride from Savannah. Eleanor turned away before she could decide what to call it. She had a house to learn, and a dowager to survive, and a husband she didn't fully know yet, and the summer was still long. Whatever she'd started, she was only just beginning to understand its shape. Margaret Ashford did not leave after the weekend. She unpacked, redistributed her belongings across the East Guest Suite, and installed herself at Harrow Hall, with the serene permanence of a woman who considered her son's home an extension of her own jurisdiction. By Monday morning, she was at the breakfast table before Eleanor came down. By Tuesday, she had spoken privately with Mrs. Dalton twice. By Wednesday, she had rearranged the flowers in the front hall without mentioning it to anyone. Eleanor noticed all of it. She said nothing about any of it. She was learning the terrain before she moved on it, which was, she had decided, the only intelligent approach to Margaret Ashford. What she hadn't anticipated was that Margaret was doing exactly the same thing to her. They were, she realized by Thursday, circling each other with a great deal of surface pleasantness, and absolutely no illusions on either side. William watched this with the expression of a man observing a weather system he had accurately predicted but could not control. "She's still here," Eleanor said to him Thursday evening in the library, where they had developed the quiet habit of ending up at the same time without quite planning it. "She is," he said. "Is this normal? Define normal." "William," he set his book down. "She stayed 3 weeks after my father died," he said. "She stayed 6 weeks when my brother married. She considers extended presence an expression of family feeling." "Or territorial claim," Eleanor said. He didn't disagree. "What happens," Eleanor said, "if I ask her directly how long she's planning to stay? She'll tell you as long as you need her. And if I tell her I don't need her, she'll tell you that you don't know yet what you need, but she's happy to help you discover it." He paused. "She's very good at this." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've noticed." She looked at him. "Has she said anything to you about me privately?" A pause that was slightly too long. "William, she said you were sharper than she expected," he said carefully. "She said I had chosen well, in her opinion, by accident rather than design, and that she hoped I understood what I had before someone else pointed it out to me." Eleanor stared at him. "She said that—" Those were almost exactly her words. "That's simultaneously the most generous and most patronizing thing I've ever heard." "Yes," William said. "That's my mother." Eleanor looked at the fire for a moment. Something about the exchange had shifted something in her chest, not resolved it, not softened the anger that still lived there about the manner of her marriage, but complicated it in ways she was still working through. "She thinks you don't see me properly," she said. "I think she might be right," William said quietly. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the fire too, not at her, which made the words land differently than if he'd been watching for her reaction. "I made a decision about what I was looking for," he said, "and I found it. And I think I've been managing the situation since we arrived rather than actually—" He stopped, tried again. "I owe you more than management." The library was very quiet. "Yes," Eleanor said, "you do." Neither of them said anything else for a while. But something had been put on the table between them finally. That wasn't performance or strategy or careful navigation, and Eleanor was aware that the shape of things had shifted slightly in the room. The county came calling on Saturday. This was apparently inevitable. William explained it the night before, with the resigned air of a man describing a natural law, because the Duke of Ashford had been absent for over 2 years, and his return, plus the entirely unexpected acquisition of a wife, had generated the kind of social interest that Savannah drawing rooms could only dream of. They came in pairs and small groups: the neighboring families, the Hadleys from Whitmore Park, the Colchester family with their 3 unmarried daughters who looked at Eleanor with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something more complicated. Judge Farron and his wife, who arrived early and stayed long and asked questions with the gentle persistence of people who considered information a form of currency. Eleanor stood in her own drawing room and received them all. She wore the best dress she'd brought from Savannah, which was fine, but not exceptional, and she was aware that several visitors had taken note of it, with the particular lateral glance that was the calling card of people who cataloged these things. She didn't adjust her posture or her expression. She shook hands, she answered questions with more warmth than she felt. She thanked people for coming. Margaret Ashford stood at her elbow for the first hour, performing the role of gracious guide with practiced ease, whispering names before Eleanor needed to ask, and supplying context in murmurs between guests. It was, Eleanor realized, genuinely helpful. It was also a performance of helpfulness, a demonstration for the room that the Dowager was present, involved, and essential to the running of this household. Eleanor let it go on for exactly 1 hour. Then she turned to Margaret and said quietly and pleasantly, "Would you like some tea? You've been standing so long. Please sit down. I can manage from here." Margaret looked at her. It was a long look. Not hostile. Nothing with Margaret was ever openly hostile, but very direct in a way that her public face usually wasn't. "Of course," she said after a moment. She sat down. Eleanor turned back to the room. Mrs. Hadley, who had been watching this exchange with the sharpness of a woman who missed nothing, caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a very small nod. Eleanor filed that away as potentially useful. By the end of the afternoon, she had learned 3 things: that the county had considered William a reasonable prospect for their daughters before his prolonged absence, and considered Eleanor an unknown quantity of uncertain origin, that Judge Farron was someone William genuinely liked and trusted, and that the Colchester family's eldest daughter, a tall and self-possessed young woman named Harriet, had watched William from across every room with an expression Eleanor had no trouble reading at all. She mentioned none of this to William. She thought about all of it. The letter from her mother arrived on the following Tuesday. Eleanor recognized the handwriting before she opened it. Catherine Whitmore's script was controlled and vertical, each letter formed with the precision of a woman who considered presentation a form of argument. Eleanor took it to the library before she read it, which was becoming her habit when she needed to think without being observed. The letter was 1 page. It was in its way a masterwork. It opened with an inquiry about her health. It moved in its second paragraph to an expression of maternal concern that managed to convey worry, reproach, and vindication simultaneously. In the third paragraph, Catherine noted with what she called relief that she had heard from Mrs. Clover, the Reverend's wife, that Eleanor appeared to have landed on her feet. The phrasing was delicate, but the implication was clear: someone had talked. Someone had said enough that Catherine knew Harrow Hall was not a modest property. The final paragraph was the one that mattered. It said, "I hope, Eleanor, that you understand now that I was trying to protect you. The situation you found yourself in is fortunate, but fortune is not the same as wisdom, and I trust you will be careful not to mistake one for the other." Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a while. Her mother had spent 22 years teaching her that love came with conditions, and that those conditions were somehow always slightly beyond reach. She had stood at Eleanor's wedding and delivered a verdict. She was now in the face of information that upended that verdict, choosing a version of events in which she had been right all along. Eleanor picked up a pen. She wrote, "Dear Mother, thank you for your letter. I am well. The house is large and the work of learning it keeps me occupied. I hope you are also well. Eleanor." She sent it before she could revise it into something more or less than what it was. She found William in the stable yard that afternoon, working alongside the head groom on something related to one of the carriage horses that had come up lame. He was in his shirt sleeves, which she'd only seen twice before, and he was doing actual work with his hands. And for a moment, she just stood and watched him. This Duke, who wore plain coats and argued with books and had apparently decided that the solution to not being seen was to hide in plain sight. He was more complicated than she'd let herself think about. That was, she realized, becoming a problem. He noticed her before she could leave. "Eleanor." She walked over. "How is he?" "He'll be fine. Heat mostly. Tom caught it early." He nodded toward the groom, who touched his cap and moved discreetly to the other side of the yard. "You look like you're thinking hard about something." "I got a letter from my mother," she said. "Ah. She's decided the whole situation reflects her good judgment in worrying about me." "How does that work logically?" "It doesn't need to work logically. She's rewritten the order of events so that she was right about the outcome, even though she had it backwards." Eleanor paused. "She does this. She's always done this. I should be used to it." "Are you?" "No," Eleanor said. "I don't think you get used to being rewritten by someone who's supposed to know you." He was quiet for a moment, not filling the space with something easier. She had noticed that about him, that he didn't rush to cover silences. Most people did. It was one of the things she thought that made him harder to dismiss than she'd wanted him to be when she was still most angry. "My father did something similar," he said. "Not rewriting, he didn't bother with narrative. He just declined to see certain things that didn't fit what he'd decided about me." He looked at the horse, not at her. "I spent about 10 years trying to make him see differently. Then I stopped." "Is that when you left?" "More or less." Eleanor looked at him. "What did he decide about you that was wrong?" A long pause. "That I was managing his estate because I was incapable of anything more," he said. "He thought I stayed because I couldn't leave. I stayed because He stopped, recalibrated. "I stayed because I believed in what the land was and what it could be. Because the tenants were real people with real needs, and someone had to give a damn about that. He thought it was weakness. I thought it was the only thing worth doing." Eleanor absorbed this. "That's not weakness," she said. "I know," he said. "Now." They stood in the stable yard in the afternoon heat, and Eleanor was aware that they were having for the first time an actual conversation. Not navigation, not negotiation, not the careful exchange of people who didn't yet trust each other. Something with a different weight to it. "William," she said. "Yes, I need you to understand something." She turned to face him directly. "I'm not angry about the house or the title. I can manage the house. I can learn what I need to learn. That's not the thing I'm still working through." "What is?" he asked, quietly, like he actually wanted the answer. "You let me stand at that altar," she said, "while my mother told a room full of people I was making a mistake. And I stayed. I stayed because I thought you had been honest with me about who you were, even if not about what you had. And now I find out that who you were was also curated, chosen. That even the simplicity of how you presented yourself was a form of performance." She held his gaze. "I don't know which version to trust. That's what I'm still working through." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was very open in a way she hadn't seen before, and not comfortable. "Both," he said finally. "They're both real. The man in the plain coat is real. The estate is real. The title is real. I didn't..." I wasn't performing plainness to deceive you. I spent 2 years not being a duke, and finding out that I could breathe, and I didn't know how to give that up, and also be honest with you, and I made a choice I should have made differently." He paused. "I don't know how to prove that, except by time." "No," Eleanor said. "You can't. Will you give me the time?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm here," she said. "That's what I have right now. I'm here." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. But it was true, and he received it as such, and they walked back toward the house without pretending it was more than what it was. Margaret cornered Eleanor the following morning in a way that was too well timed to be accidental. She came to find Eleanor in the small study Eleanor had quietly claimed as her own, a room off the east corridor that no one had been using with decent light, and a desk that fit her purposes, and she sat down in the chair across from Eleanor's without waiting to be invited, which Eleanor was beginning to understand was simply how Margaret entered rooms. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, "about what I said to William, about choosing well by accident." "He told me," Eleanor said. "You might have told me directly." "I might have," Margaret agreed. "I didn't trust you yet. And now I've watched you receive 50 county visitors with no preparation and no visible discomfort, manage Mrs. Dalton without alienating her, and hold your own at that breakfast table every morning for a week without once performing any version of what you thought I wanted to see." Margaret looked at her steadily. "I'm not given to reconsidering first positions quickly. You've made me reconsider." Eleanor set down her pen. "What was your first position?" "That William had done something romantic and foolish, and I would need to spend several months correcting it without appearing to do so. And now I think," Margaret said slowly, "that he has done something I didn't know he was capable of. He chose someone who will not be managed." She paused. "I'm not entirely sure what to do with that, but I recognize it as valuable." Eleanor looked at her. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I understand that you love your son and that you're used to being involved in his life. And I intend to learn from you genuinely. I have every intention of learning from you, because you know things about this family and this county and this world that I don't know yet." She paused. "But I need you to understand that this house is mine now. Not to the exclusion of you. But the decisions about it are mine, and I won't govern it by your approval." The room was very quiet. Margaret Ashford looked at her daughter-in-law for a long, complete moment. Then she said, "My husband's mother told me something very similar on my 3rd week in this house. I told her she was overstepping." A pause. "She was right and I was wrong, and it took me 4 years to admit it." She stood up. "I'll tell you that now instead, and save us both 4 years." She moved toward the door. "I don't approve of how William did this. I want to be clear about that. But I approve of you, Eleanor. That isn't a small thing." She left. Eleanor sat in the small study for a long moment after the door closed. Then from the hallway she heard Margaret's voice carrying back with the particular precision of a woman who knows exactly how far sound travels. "Mrs. Dalton, I'll be leaving Friday. Please have my things arranged." Eleanor exhaled. She picked up her pen and went back to work. 3 rooms away in the main corridor, she heard William say something to a footman, and in his voice for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something she was almost certain was relief. The summer was still long. There was still everything she didn't know about him, and everything he didn't know about her and her mother's letter still sat unanswered in any real way on the corner of the desk. There were tenants she hadn't met and county obligations she hadn't fulfilled and a marriage that was still mostly outline rather than filled-in shape. But Margaret was leaving Friday, and the house on this particular Thursday morning felt more like hers than it ever had before. She pressed on. That was she had decided what she did. Whatever came next, she pressed on. Margaret left on Friday as promised with her luggage and her pearls and a parting embrace for Eleanor that was brief and firm and somehow more honest than anything that had come before it. "Write to me," Margaret said at the carriage door. "Not a request, not quite a command." Something in between which Eleanor was beginning to understand was Margaret's natural register. "I will," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her one more time, with those sharp, assessing eyes, and then she looked at William, and whatever passed between them in that glance was old and layered, and not Eleanor's to read yet. Then she was in the carriage, and the carriage was moving, and the long driveway swallowed it up, and Eleanor and William stood side by side on the front steps in the summer heat and watched it go. "That went better than I expected," William said. "She approved of me," Eleanor said. "She told me so directly, which I suspect she doesn't do often." "Never in my experience." "Then I'll take it." Eleanor turned back toward the house. "Now, the tenant farm on the eastern boundary. You said I'd need to meet them eventually. I'd like to do it this week." He turned to look at her. "You want to visit the tenants?" "I want to meet the people who live on this land, yes. If I'm going to be responsible for any part of how this estate runs, I should know who it affects." She paused. "Unless there's a reason I shouldn't." "No," he said after a moment. "No, there isn't. I'll take you Thursday." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and went inside. She was already thinking about what to ask. The days between Margaret's departure and Thursday had their own rhythm, quieter than anything the first 2 weeks had offered. Without the Dowager's presence organizing the social atmosphere of the house, Harrow Hall settled into something that felt for the first time like it might become a life rather than a performance. Eleanor worked through the household accounts with Mrs. Dalton every morning. She had found to her own surprise that she was good at this, not just adequate, but genuinely capable, the kind of person who spotted a discrepancy 2 columns back and could hold 3 running totals in her head simultaneously. Mrs. Dalton watched this with an expression that started as politely concealed surprise and evolved by Wednesday into something that looked a great deal like satisfaction. "The late Duchess," Mrs. Dalton said carefully on Wednesday morning, not looking up from the ledger, was not interested in accounts. How did the household manage? "Mr. Perkins, the estate steward, handled most of it. He's capable, but he has priorities." A pause that contained a great deal. Some of the domestic expenditure over the past several years has been generous in certain areas. Eleanor looked up. "What areas?" Mrs. Dalton met her eyes. "The wine cellar in particular, ma'am, and the stable accounts, which I have always found somewhat difficult to reconcile with the actual number of horses we keep." Eleanor sat back. "Show me the stable accounts," she said. Mrs. Dalton produced them with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask. Eleanor spent 2 hours with those accounts. By the end, she had a list of questions for Mr. Perkins, the estate steward, that she was fairly certain he was not going to enjoy answering. She said nothing to William yet. She wanted to understand what she was looking at before she brought it to him. Thursday came, and she and William rode to the eastern tenant farm on horseback, which turned out to be the first time Eleanor had ridden with him. The first time she realized that she'd seen him on a horse at all. And he rode the way he did most things, with a quietness that wasn't passivity, but something more like assurance. The farm families were not what she'd braced herself for. She had expected deference, the particular careful performance of people managing their relationship with a landlord they depended on, and there was some of that. But there was also something else, a directness from the older men especially, that suggested they had known William before his years away and had formed opinions that hadn't changed with his absence. A man named Caleb in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his whole life outside, shook William's hand and then turned to look at Eleanor with the frank appraisal of someone who wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "You're the new Duchess," he said, not accusingly, just naming the fact. "I am," Eleanor said. "I've been wanting to come out here since I arrived. I wanted to meet everyone." "That's different," Caleb said. "From what?" "From the usual," he said, and didn't elaborate, but his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. They spent 3 hours at the farm. Eleanor asked questions about the soil, about the harvest rotation, about what had worked in past years and what hadn't, about the drainage issue on the north field that Caleb mentioned once, and then seemed to expect her to dismiss. She didn't dismiss it. She asked 4 more questions about it. By the end, Caleb was talking to her the way he talked to William directly, without the performative simplification people used when they thought they were speaking to someone who didn't really need to understand. On the ride back, William said, "You knew what he was talking about. The drainage." "My father had a warehouse with a water problem," Eleanor said. "Different scale, same principle. Water follows the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance on that north field is straight under the foundation of that storage barn. If they don't address the grade this fall, they'll lose the barn floor by spring." William was quiet for a moment. "I'll have the steward." He stopped. "Actually, I'll go back out there myself with Caleb. Perkins has been... I've been meaning to review his management of the eastern property." "When you do," Eleanor said carefully, "I'd like to talk to you about the household accounts first." He looked at her. "Not urgently," she said, "but soon." His jaw tightened slightly, not at her, she thought, but at whatever he'd understood in what she hadn't said. "How bad?" he asked. "I don't know yet. I want to understand it better before I say." "Tell me when you're ready," he said. "I trust your read." It was a small thing to say. It landed with unexpected weight. She turned back to the road and filed it carefully in the part of herself where she kept the things that were changing the shape of what she understood this marriage to be. The second letter from her mother arrived on a Friday, and it was nothing like the first. Eleanor opened it in her study, saw that it was 3 pages instead of 1, and felt the particular foreknowledge that came from 22 years of reading Catherine Whitmore's correspondence. 3 pages meant her mother had found out something. She was right. The letter opened pleasantly enough, more pleasantly than the first, which itself was a warning signal. Her mother had been in Savannah when a Mrs. Beaumont, apparently recently returned from visiting relatives near the Ashford County, had mentioned in passing the Duke of Ashford's return and the surprise of his new wife. The letter did not at any point use the word Duke. What it used instead was a sustained and beautifully structured series of implications. Catherine Whitmore had clearly written and rewritten this letter until every word did exactly the work she wanted it to do. There was the maternal concern elevated this time into something that managed to sound like dignity. There was the implication that Eleanor had withheld significant information, which was technically true, though Eleanor noted that the information had been withheld because she hadn't had it to give. There was the suggestion in the second page that whatever estrangement had grown between them might now, given the changed circumstances, be worth revisiting. And then, in the third page, there it was, "I have been speaking with Thomas Aldridge, who remains, as you know, very well connected in the county. He has expressed an interest in traveling north this summer for business purposes, and mentioned that he had always wished to see more of that part of the country. I thought you might like to know." Eleanor read that paragraph 3 times. Then she set the letter down and looked at the wall. Thomas Aldridge, 53 years old, owner of the mill and the grain warehouse, and the ear of the county magistrate. The man her mother had first proposed she marry, coming north for business purposes that had nothing to do with business. Her mother was not subtle. She never had been. But she had learned over a lifetime to dress her maneuvers in enough pleasant language that you couldn't object to the surface, while the mechanism underneath it ran exactly where she'd aimed it. Eleanor picked up her pen and wrote 3 sentences. "Dear Mother, I'm afraid the summer is a very busy time for receiving visitors we do not already know. I hope Thomas Aldridge finds the north countryside agreeable. Eleanor." She sealed it and gave it to the footman before the ink was properly dry. Then she sat for a moment and thought about what her mother was trying to do and why, and the conclusion she arrived at was both simple and complicated. Catherine Whitmore was afraid. She had lost the narrative, the story in which she was the protective mother whose judgment had been vindicated, and she was trying to reinsert herself into Eleanor's life at the new scale. Not out of cruelty. Out of the particular desperation of a woman who had built her entire sense of purpose around managing Eleanor's future and suddenly found that future had outgrown her reach. Eleanor understood it. She didn't intend to allow it. She went to find William. She found him in the estate office with a man she hadn't met before, tall, thin, somewhere in his 40s, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who'd been caught doing something he'd expected to have more time to prepare for. This, she understood immediately, was Perkins. William looked up when she came in. His expression told her that she had walked in at a moment that mattered, that the conversation she'd interrupted was not a comfortable one. "Eleanor," he said. "Come in. This is Mr. Perkins. We were just reviewing the Eastern property accounts." "Mr. Perkins," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Your Grace?" Perkins said with a bow that was correct in form and slightly desperate in execution. "Please don't let me interrupt," she said, and sat down in the chair nearest the door and folded her hands in her lap. There was a pause in which Perkins appeared to calculate whether he could ask her to leave, and concluded that he could not. Then William laid 3 documents on the desk and said very quietly, "Explain these to me, Perkins. The grain storage figures from last autumn. Walk me through them." What followed was 20 minutes that Eleanor observed in complete silence and found utterly clarifying. Perkins was not a dishonest man. She decided not at his core, but he was a man who had been managing an absent duke's estate with significant unsupervised discretion for 2 years, and had developed certain habits of convenience that he had convinced himself were reasonable, and that were in fact not. The grain storage figures were the most obvious. There were others. William's voice remained quiet throughout. That was, she was learning how he operated when he was most serious. The volume came down rather than up, and the words became more precise and more final, and the effect was considerably more frightening than shouting would have been. By the end, Perkins had the look of a man who had walked into a room expecting one conversation and found another entirely. "You'll provide me with a full accounting," William said. "Everything from the past 2 years. I want it on this desk by Monday." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Perkins." William looked at him. "I will be reviewing the accounts myself going forward. Mrs. Cross will also have full access to any estate documentation she requests. You will cooperate with that without exception." A flicker of something crossed Perkins's face, a reassessment, a recalibration, as he glanced at Eleanor, and understood that the woman he'd initially categorized as the new Duchess, pleasant and decorative, and unlikely to look at grain storage figures, had in fact already looked at them. "Of course, Your Grace," he said. After he left, the office was quiet for a moment. "How much did you already know?" Eleanor asked. "Some of it," William said. "Not the grain storage. That was new today." He looked at her. "You'd found it." "I'd found something that looked like it. I wasn't certain." He nodded slowly. "How did you know what to look for?" "My father wasn't a good businessman," Eleanor said, "which means I grew up watching a business fail in particular ways. I know what the numbers look like when someone is helping themselves to a percentage." She paused. "Perkins isn't stealing outright. He's shaving margins and calling it efficiency, but it accumulates." "Over 2 years it accumulates considerably," William said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to fully decode, the one that was recalibration and something more personal underneath it. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing it carefully, for not assuming before you knew." "I don't assume," Eleanor said. "I look first." "I know," he said. "I'm glad of it." 3 days later, the thing she hadn't seen coming arrived, and it came not from Perkins or her mother or the county or anywhere she'd been watching. It came from a woman named Harriet Colchester. Eleanor was in town, a small thing, a visit to the dry goods merchant on an errand she'd invented partly because she wanted to walk somewhere that wasn't Harrow Hall and think without its walls around her. She was standing at the counter when she heard her name. Harriet Colchester was with 2 other women Eleanor half recognized from the county reception. She was smiling the way she had been smiling at William across the drawing room, composed, deliberate, a smile that knew exactly what it was doing. "Mrs. Cross," she said. "Or I suppose I should say Your Grace. We haven't had a chance to speak properly." "Miss Colchester," Eleanor said, "it's good to see you." "I understand you came from Savannah quite recently," Harriet said. "Quite suddenly, I imagine." A sympathetic tilt of the head. "It must be overwhelming managing a house like Harrow Hall without the preparation one might have had." Eleanor looked at her. "I'm managing well enough. she said. "Thank you for your concern." "Of course." Another smile. "William is an old friend. We've known each other since childhood. I just want to make sure he and you are well situated." A pause. "He's a complicated man. It takes time to understand him." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It does. Fortunately, I have time." A tiny flicker behind Harriet's eyes. "Of course. I only meant if you ever have questions. About the county, about the family history, about any of the things that might be opaque to someone newly arrived. I'd be happy to help. As a friend." "That's very kind," Eleanor said, in the voice she'd learned from 22 years of watching her mother operate. Warm, clear, and immovable. "I'll keep that in mind." She paid for her items and left. She was a block from the merchants when she stopped walking and stood for a moment and did not do anything except breathe. Then she started walking again faster toward the carriage. She had understood in that shop with complete and quiet clarity that she was not simply managing an unfamiliar house or a complicated marriage or a difficult mother. She was navigating a world that had decided before she arrived what she was and wasn't capable of, and that would continue at intervals and through various representatives to test whether it was right. She had held her ground with Margaret. She had held her ground with Perkins. She had held her ground with her mother. She would hold it here too. The carriage took her back to Harrow Hall, through the long gates, and under the oak trees, and Eleanor rode with her back straight and her hands still in her lap, and looked out the window at the land that was hers, and thought, not a single one of them has made me flinch. But when she got inside, and William came into the hallway to meet her, because he'd apparently seen the carriage, and said, "How was town?" with a casualness that didn't quite cover his attention, she stopped. "I ran into Harriet Colchester," she said. Something moved across his face, fast, gone before she could name it. "What did she say?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him, steady, level. "What is she to you, William? Not historically. Now, what is she?" The hallway was very still. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she watched him decide. Something. Watched him choose, as she had watched him choose only occasionally. Not the careful answer, but the true one. "Nothing," he said. There was an expectation before I left. On her side more than mine, and on both our mothers' sides significantly more than either of us. Nothing happened. I left before it could. And I came back married." He paused. "She had a reasonable expectation that didn't come true. I don't think that's nothing to her." Eleanor absorbed this. "And to you?" she asked. "To me," he said. "I am standing in my hallway with my wife asking me what she means to me. And the answer is nothing. Not dismissively, just not anything I chose." Eleanor stood in the hallway and looked at her husband for a long, complete moment. Then she said, "All right." "That's all?" he asked. "That's all," she said. "I asked, you told me. That's what I needed." She moved toward the stairs. "Tell me if that changes." "It won't," he said with the certainty of a man who is not performing certainty. Eleanor climbed the stairs and did not look back, but she was aware all the way up of the particular quality of the silence. He left behind her, not uncertain, not wounded, not complicated. Just steady. That was new. She reached the top of the stairs and turned toward her rooms, and stopped briefly alone in the hallway, and let herself acknowledge quietly without drama, with the same practicality she brought to ledgers and tenant farms and her mother's letters, that something had shifted between them, that she had not planned on shifting, and she did not entirely know what to do with it yet, but it was there, and it was real, and it was hers as much as his. She went into her room and closed the door and stood for a moment in the late afternoon quiet. Whatever she was building here, she was building it with her own hands on her own terms, in a house that was learning to fit her shape. That was not nothing. That she thought might be everything. The week after the conversation in the hallway was different. Eleanor couldn't have named exactly what changed, only that something had. William moved through the house with less of the careful distance he'd maintained since she'd confronted him in the sitting room on their first night, and she moved through it with less of the deliberate separateness she'd built as a counterweight to that distance. They didn't announce the change. They didn't discuss it. It simply happened the way most real things happen, not in a moment, but in an accumulation of small ones. He started coming to find her in the mornings, rather than waiting for her to come down. Not dramatically, just appearing at the door of her study with 2 cups of coffee, setting one on her desk, and saying something about the estate that required her actual opinion rather than her polite agreement. She started answering with her actual opinion, without softening it for the sake of smoothness. He didn't flinch from that. She hadn't expected him to quite, but it was still something to see confirmed. Mrs. Dalton observed all of this with the satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting 16 years for the house to feel inhabited. Eleanor noticed Mrs. Dalton's satisfaction and said nothing about it because some things were better left unnarrated. She was making progress on the accounts. The full picture of Perkins's management over 2 years was coming into focus, and it was not a comfortable picture, but it was a comprehensible one. The kind of problem that could be corrected if you were willing to do the work of correcting it. She brought it to William on a Tuesday, laid out in 4 pages she'd written herself, and he read it at the desk while she sat across from him and watched him understand what he was reading. When he looked up, his expression had the particular quality of a man absorbing something that confirmed a suspicion he'd hoped was wrong. "How long to fix it?" he asked. "A full accounting year if Perkins cooperates and the harvest figures hold," she said. "Less if we address the Eastern property leasing terms, which haven't been revised in 11 years and are undercharging by at least 15%. "You calculated that." "I compared them against the Hadley estate terms. Mrs. Hadley mentioned in passing that they'd revised theirs 3 years ago. I asked her very casually what benchmark they used." He stared at her. "You got the Hadley leasing benchmark from a social call." "She was pleased to be consulted," Eleanor said. "People generally are." William set the document down, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her with an expression she'd stopped trying to classify and had started simply receiving. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "I made a poor decision about how to find a wife," he said. "I have made since then a series of better decisions about how to be a husband to the one I found. I want you to know that I'm aware of the difference, and I'm aware that the second set of decisions doesn't cancel out the first." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It doesn't. But I'd like to keep making them anyway." "I know," she said. "I can tell." A pause. "I'm letting you." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face was very quiet and very sure. "That's enough," he said. "For now, that's enough." She picked up her coffee and went back to work, and he did the same, and the office held the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed to fill it. The 3rd week of August arrived with a heat that sat over the county like a physical weight, and with it came something Eleanor had not anticipated: a visitor who was not her mother, and not Harriet Colchester, and not anyone she'd been watching for. His name was Mr. Gerald Ashford, William's brother. Eleanor didn't know William had a brother until Gerald Ashford was standing in the entrance hall. She came down the stairs and stopped 3 steps from the bottom, because the man standing below her had William's height and a different version of William's face, coarser, louder in its arrangement, with none of William's stillness, and he was looking around Harrow Hall with the expression of a man who had complicated feelings about a place he'd once expected to inherit. She understood the situation in approximately 4 seconds. Then she descended the remaining stairs and said, "You must be Gerald. I'm Eleanor, William's wife." Gerald Ashford turned to look at her. He had the kind of eyes that assessed quickly and didn't bother to hide that they were doing it. "The wife," he said. "The famous wife. You're all anyone in Charleston could talk about." A smile that was almost warm. "Mother wrote to me." "I imagine she did," Eleanor said. William came through from the corridor and stopped when he saw his brother. Something passed over his face that Eleanor was learning to read as controlled history, the expression he wore when something from before reached forward into the present. "Gerald," he said. "William." Gerald spread his hands. "I was passing through. Thought I'd pay my respects to the new establishment." His eyes moved between them, reading something. "You look well," Better than I expected, honestly. Marriage suits you. What are you actually doing here? William said. Not rudely, just directly, with the ease of someone who had known a person long enough to skip the scaffolding. Gerald's smile adjusted slightly. Can't a man visit his brother? You haven't visited in 2 years. You didn't come when father died. I was in Boston. You know I was in Boston. I know you were in Boston, William said. I also know that Boston is not so far as to make a funeral impossible. He said this without heat as a statement of fact that they had apparently both agreed to carry without resolution for some time. Come in, Gerald. We'll have supper. Supper was instructive in ways Eleanor hadn't predicted. Gerald Ashford was charming in the particular way of someone who had learned that charm was his most reliable tool, and he deployed it fluently on Eleanor, on Mrs. Dalton, on the footman, on the wine. He was funny, actually. Funny with the quick observational humor of a man who had spent years reading rooms. Eleanor liked him despite herself, which she noted with some caution as a potential liability. But underneath the charm she watched. Gerald asked questions about the estate that were too specific for casual curiosity. He asked about the Eastern property lease terms, the exact thing she'd been reviewing, with a lightness that was working hard. He mentioned twice that father had discussed revising the inheritance structure before his death. Both times he glanced at William when he said it, and both times William's expression didn't change. After supper, Gerald went to change from the road, and Eleanor found herself alone with William in the corridor for the first time all evening. The inheritance, she said, quietly. What is he talking about? William was quiet for a moment. Our father considered in the last year of his life entailing part of the estate differently. Gerald was involved in those conversations. Was any of it formalized? No. Father died before anything was signed. He looked at her steadily. Gerald believes there was an understanding. There was not a legal document. Eleanor absorbed this. He thinks he has a claim. He thinks he has a moral claim, William said, which is a different thing and a more complicated one to argue against. Does he? William looked at her for a long moment. My father was difficult to the end, he said. He said different things to different people in his last months. I can't tell you with certainty what he intended. I can tell you what was legal, and what was legal is not in dispute. But Gerald disputes the spirit of it. Gerald disputes whatever is most useful to Gerald, William said with a tiredness that was not contempt, but something older. I love my brother. I am also under no illusions about him. Eleanor looked at him. He came because he heard you were back and married and moving on the estate again. He came to assess the situation. Yes. What does he want? Money, William said simply. Gerald always wants money. He spends it at a rate that his personal income cannot sustain, and he has been hoping since father died that I would feel guilty enough about the inheritance to supplement it. Do you feel guilty? A pause. Sometimes, he said honestly. Not enough to give him what he'd spend it on. Eleanor filed all of this and said, I'll handle supper tomorrow night. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means, let me talk to him, she said. Directly, without the history between you in the room. He studied her for a moment. Eleanor, I'm not going to do anything that isn't yours to decide, she said. I'm going to listen. People tell you things when they think you're just the wife. He held her gaze. Then slowly, all right. Good, she said. Go have a drink with your brother. Don't talk about the estate. She had Gerald to herself for 40 minutes the next afternoon in the garden, which she'd arranged by asking him to show her which of the rose varieties were original to the estate and which had been planted by his mother. A question that turned out to be exactly right, because Gerald had opinions about this and was pleased to share them, and by the time he'd finished, they were sitting on a bench in the summer heat and talking like people who knew each other. You're not what I expected, Gerald said at some point. What did you expect? Honestly, someone William could manage. He said it without cruelty, just observation. He has a tendency to organize things, his life included. I thought he'd find someone agreeable and capable and essentially a pendant. And instead, Gerald looked at her with something like respect. Instead, I find the estate accounts have been reviewed. Perkins looks like a man who's had a bad week. The tenants on the eastern boundary apparently spoke very warmly of their new duchess when my man Ridley passed through, and you just spent 20 minutes getting me to tell you everything I know about the rose garden under the impression that I was educating you. He paused. You already knew which ones were original, didn't you? Eleanor smiled. Mrs. Dalton told me the first week. Gerald laughed. Actually laughed. God, he said. William has no idea what he stumbled into. He's beginning to, Eleanor said. Is he treating you well? She looked at him. The question was real, she thought. Underneath the charm and the calculation there was something genuine in it. Yes, she said. He's learning to. We both are. Gerald nodded slowly. He's a better man than my father gave him credit for, he said. I want you to know I know that. Whatever else, I know that. Tell me about the inheritance, Eleanor said. The shift was abrupt enough that Gerald blinked. Then he smiled a different smile, smaller, more real. Direct, he said. Always, she said. Tell me. He told her. Not the maneuvering version, not the version shaped for maximum sympathy. The actual version, which was this: their father had told Gerald in the last months of his life that he intended to establish a separate trust from the estate income that would provide Gerald with a reliable annual income. Not an inheritance of property, not a claim on Harrow Hall. An income. Something that would stop Gerald needing to scramble. The trust had never been written because their father had died of a sudden fever before the solicitor had been called. I'm not claiming the estate, Gerald said. I'm not that far gone. I know what's legal. I'm saying there was an intention, and it died with him, and I've been... He stopped. For the first time the charm slipped, and underneath it was something that was just tired. It's been a hard 2 years, Eleanor. I won't dress it up. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. If I speak to William about an income arrangement, she said carefully, not as a legal obligation, but as a family decision, would you stop the maneuvering? Would you come here and talk to him directly without the positioning? Gerald stared at her. You'd do that. I'd have the conversation, she said. What he decides is his to decide. But I think he'd rather help his brother than watch him circle the estate like a man deciding whether to knock on the door. She held his gaze. I think you'd rather knock. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally in a voice that was just his. No performance in it. I would. Then come to supper tonight, she said, and talk to your brother. She told William before supper. All of it what Gerald had said, what she'd offered to facilitate what she thought was true, and what she thought was strategy, and where she couldn't tell the difference. She didn't shape it. She laid it flat. William listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You believe him. About what father said. I believe he believes it, Eleanor said. Whether your father said it exactly that way, I don't know. I think your father probably said something like it because it sounds like the kind of promise a difficult man makes when he's dying and doesn't want to do the paperwork while he's living. She paused. I think Gerald has been carrying it for 2 years, and it's made him worse than he would otherwise be. He's not a bad man, William said. He's a careless one. Careless people need structure, Eleanor said. An income they can rely on is structure. It stops them making bad decisions trying to generate their own. William looked at her. You've thought this through. I watched my father's business fail partly because the people around him had no reliable income and made desperate decisions as a result, she said. I know what money insecurity does to a person's judgment. He was quiet for a moment. What would you do, he asked, if it were your decision? I'd give him the income, she said. Not because your father promised it and not out of guilt. Because he's your brother and because having him steady and not scrambling is better for everyone, including you. She paused. But it's not my decision. No, William said. "It's ours." She looked at him. "You're part of this family," he said simply. "This is a family decision. What do you think we should do?" The word we landed with the weight of something that had been building since a carriage ride out of Savannah and had arrived finally here. "I think we should take care of him," Eleanor said, quietly and without conditions and without making him ask again. "Then that's what we'll do," William said. Supper that night was different from the one before. Gerald came to the table without the charm fully deployed, which made him paradoxically easier to like. William spoke to him the way he spoke to people he trusted directly without performance. They talked about their father for the first time, Eleanor thought, without either of them managing the conversation's shape. There were things said that weren't comfortable, and things acknowledged that had been set aside for years, and Eleanor sat at the table and ate her supper and said very little because it wasn't hers to say, and understood that she was witnessing something that the house had needed for a long time. By the end of the meal, Gerald knew about the income arrangement. He didn't thank William with words. He looked at him, and something passed between them that was older than language, and William nodded once. And that was the whole of it. Gerald left the next morning. At the door, he took Eleanor's hand and said, "I came here to assess a situation. I leave considerably more assessed than I intended." He glanced at William. "She's something your wife." "I know," William said. "Do you?" Gerald asked, and there was something in it that wasn't quite a question. William looked at Eleanor, and the look was direct and unhurried and entirely real. "Yes," he said. "I'm beginning to." Gerald left. The carriage went down the long drive. The oak trees held the morning light. In the second week of September, a letter came from Eleanor Whitmore that was 2 sentences long. Eleanor, I have heard from several sources that you have settled well. I am glad of it. No mention of Thomas Aldridge, no repositioning, no structure of implication underneath the surface. Just 2 sentences that meant in Eleanor Whitmore's language more than a page would have. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. Not because she didn't know what to do with it, she did, but because she wanted to feel it properly before she moved past it. Her mother was not going to change. She was not going to become a different kind of woman, or find a different way to love. And Eleanor had understood that for a long time, but had spent years hoping otherwise. The 2 sentences were not reconciliation. They were not an apology. They were the most her mother knew how to give, and for the first time Eleanor received them without grieving the distance between what was given and what she'd wanted. She wrote back, "Dear Mother, I am well. The work here suits me. I hope Savannah is cool enough this fall. Eleanor." She meant every word of it. On an evening in late September, with the summer finally breaking and the first edge of autumn in the air, Eleanor found William in the library. Their library, she thought, without correcting herself, because it had become that, and he was standing at the window and not reading. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He turned. "You," he said without the careful pause she'd come to expect before honest answers. Just directly, like it was simple. She looked at him. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the fact that I came home from 2 years away, expecting to find I don't know exactly what I expected. Something manageable, something that fit inside the life I'd already outlined." He moved away from the window. "And instead, my life has been reviewed, reorganized, significantly improved in ways I didn't ask for, and I find myself standing in my own library being better than I was before, and I didn't see any of it coming." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to hold his eyes. "I want to tell you that I see you, Eleanor. Not the situation you solved, or the household you learned, or the accounts you corrected. You. I want you to know I see you." Eleanor stood very still. She had been practical for so long. Practical as a survival strategy, practical as a substitute for hope, practical because the world she'd grown up in had a way of punishing women who let themselves want too much. She had brought practicality to this marriage, and it had served her well. But this was not a practical moment, and she was tired suddenly of being only practical. "I see you too," she said. "I have for a while. I just wasn't ready to say so." "And now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "I'm ready." He reached up and took her hand carefully the way he'd been careful with her from the beginning. The carefulness that was not timidity, but respect, and held it. They stood in the library in the early autumn evening and didn't say anything else for a while because everything that needed to be said had been, and what remained between them now was not words. Catherine Whitmore never came to Harrow Hall. Eleanor did not invite her, and her mother did not ask to come, and the distance between them became something they both maintained without either acknowledging it. A boundary held by mutual silence, which was perhaps the most honest arrangement they'd ever reached. Perkins provided his full accounting. It was worse in some areas, and better in others than Eleanor had projected. She and William worked through it over 3 weeks, revised the estate management structure, and promoted a young man from the tenant farm, a relative of Caleb's, sharp and hard-working, who understood both the land and the ledgers, to a newly created position that Perkins, after some negotiation, accepted as a reasonable settlement. Caleb's Northfield drainage problem was fixed before winter. The barn floor survived the spring. Margaret wrote twice, then began writing monthly, which Eleanor understood was the highest expression of ongoing approval the Dowager Duchess was capable of. Eleanor wrote back with the same regularity. Their correspondence was factual, occasionally dry, and entirely genuine, which made it the most honest relationship Eleanor had with any of the Ashford family, including, for a time, William. Though by winter, that had changed too. It changed the way everything real changed, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of mornings with coffee, and evenings in the library, and arguments about the accounts and conversations that ran later than they'd planned, and silences that were no longer negotiated but simply shared. It changed in the way of two people who have decided, each in their own time, to stop managing a situation and start living in it. Eleanor Whitmore had walked out of her mother's house with 3 coins and a leather satchel, and a refusal to become inventory. She had stood at an altar while her mother pronounced her foolish and chosen anyway, chosen with incomplete information, chosen imperfectly, chosen with the only currency she'd had left, which was her own judgment. Her judgment had not been wrong, not about the house that learned to fit her shape, not about the man who had been hiding in plain sight and who turned out when the hiding was over to be someone worth knowing, not about the work she'd found here and done here and made her own by the force of showing up for it every day. Eleanor Cross stood in the library of Harrow Hall on a December evening in 1814, fire-going husband across from her, arguing with a book in the margins. 800 acres of winterland outside the window, that was hers as much as anyone's, and she thought, "My mother told me I was throwing my life away. I was throwing it forward. There is a difference, and I was right about it all along.